This lecture marks lecture number 1543 since year 1900. And at RAS Korea, tonight's lecture needs no introduction, but those who are new here, I'll try to introduce him briefly. Dr. Robert Fouser holds a BA in Japanese language and literature and master's in applied linguistics, both from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in applied linguistics from Trinity College in Dublin. He studied Korean language at Seoul National University in the 80s and lived in Japan from 95 to 2008, where he taught foreign language education at Kyoto University and also developed the Korean language program at Kagoshima University. He also taught Korean as a second/foreign language at Seoul National University from 2008 to 2014. And he is currently an independent scholar based in Providence, Rhode Island, soon to be Washington, D.C. He is the author of several books, I believe 5 and the 6th one coming out.
7th one.
Six books already, and 7th one coming out at the end of this month. That's why he's busy lately. And you can also find his columns in both in English and in Korean in various media outlets in Korea. Tonight, he will tell us about historical and linguistic points of contention in Hangeul. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Fouser.
This is forward. Oops. Thank you. So I'm very honored and pleased to be back and giving a talk at the RAS. This was, when I lived in Korea, this was one of the rites of passage of anybody who, people who live in Korea. And last year was one of the only years in a very long time that I didn't give a lecture. So I'm very pleased to be with all of you today. And the topic today, can everybody hear me? Is it okay? Do you want me to pretend that you're sleepy students and speak up louder so that you don't go to, no, I'm just joking. No, yeah. So anyway, today's lecture came from the 7th book that Denny mentioned. I write books in Korean, which is kind of a strange hobby, but I do it to keep my language skills up because I live in Rhode Island and there aren't many Koreans. There's a lot of snow and cold weather in the winter. That's about it. So I write books in Korean to keep my language skills up. And the current book, which should be out in about 2 weeks, is on the spread of writing systems. So as a linguist, I thought that would be a knockoff topic and I would write this book in a year and kind of close my eyes and write it and it would write itself. It didn't turn out that way. Everything I found was very contentious and all kinds of issues and how to interpret the history of writing systems. And Hangeul also had that I found all these different opinions. I would read some very authoritative text and they would tell me this, and I would read another authoritative text and they would tell me something else. And I started to kind of go crazy thinking that maybe my reading comprehension skills were falling. So this lecture came from the process of writing the book. And I'm just going to focus on Hangeul, but I finally got things sort of figured out and was able to finish the book. But I wanted to share with people what I found out about the controversies regarding Hangeul. Because the controversies are in the academic world. Some of them don't make it into the official sort of discourse, which is fine, but I found them quite interesting. So I'm going to focus on, first I'm going to give you a little background about Hangeul. This is very basic stuff, but some things I find interesting that you might want to know. And then we're going to talk about the question, debate number 1 is who created Hangeul? And all of you are looking at me and saying, well, it's King Sejong created Hangeul. What are you talking about? There are people who don't think he created Hangeul. And I read their work, and some of them have full tenure jobs at universities and get paid, So there is debate about this, quite an interesting debate. And then as I kept digging into it, I found that my own position was shifting. So, I'll tell you about that. And then the second debate is Hangeul ex nihilo, or is it from the beginning? Is it totally new writing system, or was it influenced by other writing systems? And this is a big point of contention because some scholars have argued that it was influenced by other writing systems. Others other people will get very angry at that, assertion. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is Hangul use in the Joseon, the Joseon period. And this is not really a point of contention, but as I kept reading and working on the book, I found that Hangul was actually used more than we think it was. So that was kind of an interesting finding. So that'll be the 3rd point. And then I'll give you a conclusion and my own opinions on each of these topics. So just before Hangul, everybody knows it was, but these 2 dates are actually quite interesting. Hangul was invented in 1443. We don't know when or how exactly, but anyway, Hangul was invented in 1443 and it was promulgated or announced to the public 3 years later in 1446. So that 3-year gap is actually quite interesting because that's when King Sejong was experimenting with using it and refining it. The actual invention took place in 1443. So in English, the Hunmin Jeongeum is the correct sounds for the instruction of the people. So this is the Hangul. And all of you know, if you look at this, what is very interesting about Hangul, say you have gyok, this sound. To make a strong sound, you double it. And then to make an aspirated sound, you add another element. So this is what people refer to. And this adding another element, this second line here goes to tiat, biup, and you can see that there's a system for representing the sounds of the language. So this is where people start to, argue that Hangul is very scientific because it's very regular. Eung is quite interesting because if this is in a final position, it's pronounced right? If it's in an initial position, it has no sound. So it's very easy for people, it's using one symbol for 2 different things, which is very economical. So this is, the introduction to and the other thing that's interesting about Hangul is each of these things, the things that I just showed you, these would be called a grapheme. There are other way you can call it a letter, but I'm going to be fancy and use the linguistic term, which is grapheme. So that means that the graphemes, this is hier, da, nian, they are organized into syllables. And they're not organized into syllables linearly, they're organized to syllables in blocks. And this is also very economical. So if anybody remembers the 1990s in Korea, where before mobile phones, there were pipi or hochulgi. Anybody remember that? Anybody old enough to remember that? That was, you could send more information in Hangul than you could in English because of this, graphemes being organized into these syllable blocks. So this is an interesting thing about Hangul that is different from most writing systems in the world. Most writing systems are linear. And I don't know what the Korean members of our audience, if you were in high school, did your teacher tell you that Hangul is a scientific writing system? Most teachers would probably tell you this, and this is what it's known for. When people say Hangul is a scientific writing system, this is really what they're talking about, is that the letters show elements of where the sound is made. Okay, so the letters in Hangul show elements in your mouth where the sound is made. So you have, for example, this would show the placement of your tongue. Nian is your tongue is sort of coming up like that, and then mium bilabial, so your lips are closed, and then this sound is for the windpipe, so that goes down. So the people argue that Hangul is scientific because it doesn't just represent each grapheme, or doesn't just represent a sound. It represents the process, physical process of where in your mouth you make the sound. So that point is related to the one I just told you about this, which is doubling. You're doubling, you're adding. Same with the vowels. You have ah, and you add a line and you get the y sound, right? So the system is reflecting additional elements in the way that you go about making the sounds. The problem with this is that this wasn't what King Sejong was interested in. He didn't sit around and say, I'm going to make the perfect linguistic system. This was sort of a byproduct. King Sejong's main interest was making a system that would allow for the proper pronunciation of Chinese in Korean. He wanted to make it easy for people to pronounce the Hancha, right? The Chinese characters, to give the correct pronunciation. So this is sort of a byproduct. His goal was not to make a phonetically elegant writing system. It was to make an easy writing system that would show the pronunciation of Chinese characters, because until Hangeul, there was no system that could do that. So this is sort of an interesting byproduct, but it's something that if you talk to your Korean, Google Nim, when people say Korean is scientific, this is what they're referring to. Okay, so debate number one, who created Hangeul? Has anybody seen this movie? Anybody seen this movie? You probably haven't. It's on Amazon Prime if you want to see it. And I saw it twice for this lecture, but this film came out in 2019 and was panned. It was very, very critically, it was criticized by a lot of people because it argued that a Buddhist monk, Shinmi, who influenced King Sejong and in making Hangeul, and that Hangeul was essentially influenced by Buddhist languages. So that would be, say, South Asian, right? Indian languages, Sanskrit, this kind of thing. So it's very critically, that's not what people want to believe. People want to believe that King Sejong made the Hangeul himself. So the problem then, this film only lasted about a month, and it was taken down and it's sort of been panned. And later they found out that some of the research that went into, the argument that this Buddhist monk Shinmi influenced Sejong in making Hangeul, that was based on falsified information. And so they later found out that there's not much to support the argument. But it was interesting that this film was criticized because it went against the myth that King Sejong made Hangeul. So what's the problem? The problem is there's no official record of the development process. The Sejong Shillok, which is part of the Joseon, Wangjo Shillok, the Sejong Shillok doesn't have any reference to the meetings. There's no records of the meetings. There is a reference, which I'll show you, that King Sejong made Hangeul, but there's no detailed record of the process of development. Why would that be? That would be because King Sejong wanted to do it in secret, because developing Hangeul was against the dominant Confucian ideas at the time that Chinese culture is the culture that Korea should benchmark, or that is the high culture. And so there's no record. So that leaves us with a big problem. The other interesting thing about Hangeul is as I just mentioned, all the detailed linguistic analysis. So somebody had to do this, right? Somebody had to say, what's the shape of your mouth when you do gyok, right? Han, somebody had to play around with your mouth. They had mirrors back then. Mirrors go back to the Joseon Dynasty if you go to the National Museum. So people were, they had tools to do it. But it's a very high level sort of linguistic analysis in the writing system, and that is kind of curious. So some people wonder, where did that come from? Then the other issue is there was resistance from some high-ranking officials, most notably Chae Li. So some of the high-ranking officials in the Joseon period, they were against Hangeul because Mongolian language, Tibetan language, the languages of the uncivilized people around China, they had their own alphabet. So they thought that making a Korean writing system would put Korea down to their level. And so Korea should not follow the Mongolians and the Tibetans and other people who have their own language. Korea should stay loyal to Chinese. Okay, so that was Che Mali's argument. Why do you want to act like a barbarian? We've been loyal to China. We accept Chinese culture. We recognize the, Chinese culture as an inspiration for our country, right? At the time, the early Joseon Dynasty. So this was, Che Mali was very critical of this. And that's an interesting point. Because that suggests then that King Sejong was aware of opposition and he wanted to do it in secret. Okay, so and 1443, just remember that date. The Joseon Dynasty was founded when? 1392. Oh, we're all good at history. Yeah. So that's about what, it's around 50 years. Let's just say 50 years. And 50 years is not that long, okay? So we kind of think the founding of the Joseon Dynasty, then we have Sejong, and then we have these events that kind of go through the Joseon Dynasty. But 50 years really isn't that long. So the orthodoxy of the Joseon Dynasty was Confucianism. So there was this energetic period of reaching out to China, adopting Confucian ideas. And remember, China, of course, the new dynasty at the time in China was the Ming Dynasty, right? The Ming Dynasty had overthrown the Mongols, the Yuan Dynasty, which was Mongol dominated. Joseon overthrew the Goryeo Dynasty, which had deep connection with with the Yuan Dynasty because it occupied Korea. So both were in line with each other in Korea wanted to make itself look good in the eyes of the Ming Dynasty, and the Ming Dynasty wanted Korea as an example of a country that's following it. So the Ming Dynasty also used Korea. It wasn't just Korea using the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty used Korea. Oh, Korea is a good example of a country that's following our rule. And it was all new at the time. So that is where you get, the background. Now, the main argument, here we have the sole authorship theory. This is the theory that King Sejong was the only person who wrote Hangeul, that it's almost like people discussing Abraham Lincoln, or, that kind of thing. Like there's this divine, Abraham Lincoln might have been divinely inspired. I don't know. But, you have this sort of reverence in the popular discourse for the leader. So this argument is King Sejong invented Hangeul entirely on his own, and he kept everything secret, and he announced it, and it was done. And he was able to push it through because he was a king. The leading proponent, and these are a lot of names here, but it's important to remember, I romanized them according to how they romanized their names in English. I didn't follow another romanization system. Lee Gi-moon is probably the most famous Korean linguist of the post-liberation period. And he's no longer with us, but he really established Korean linguistics as a very serious academic field. He was a professor at Seoul National. So his name is something you need to remember if you're interested in Korean linguistics. Lee Gi-moon, he argued that King Sejong was the sole creator. So the theory got a lot of boost from Lee Gi-moon. And then we have other people, and this is just another example. Lee Hyun-hee is another example, but there are many others. This is the dominant theory. And the entry in the Sejong-shillok says in December 1443, His Majesty personally created the 28 letters, okay? So this is the official record. That's about it. That's about it for the official record of Hangeul. So there's no background of did he do it alone? Did he do it with somebody else? But a lot of people point to this as evidence that he did it by himself and then announced it. And then the other thing is there's a scholar, Jung In-ji, who wrote an explanation about Hangeul at the end of the Hunmin Jeongum, and that book was published as the Hunmin Jeongum Haere in 1446. And he also noted that King Sejong developed Hangeul by himself. Then the collaborative theory, and this is where Hangeul nationalists get very angry and upset. The collaborative theory is the idea that King Sejong directed elite scholars in the Jipyeonjeon Hall of Worthies, which is in Gyeongbok Palace. You can go see it. It's been rebuilt. a royal academy to create a new script. So this is a totally different approach. This is King Sejong getting scholars together and telling them to come up with a new writing system. And this gets its leading proponents are Kang Shin-hang and others, and they emphasize, anybody who takes this line of argument emphasizes that it was a collaborative effort, that King Sejong was working with these scholars in the Jipyeonjeon and creating Hangeul. Then, and evidence for this is other records. You have the Yeongjae Chonghwa is a record that talks about King Sejong ordering scholars, particularly Shin Suk-ju. Shin Suk-ju is a very famous scholar of the Joseon period. He was fluent in a lot of languages. He went to China, he went to Japan. I don't know if there's evidence of him speaking Japanese, but he certainly knew spoken Chinese as well as of course, literary Chinese. So Shin Suk-ju is a really, the polyglot of the early Joseon period. And he was a member of the Jipyeonjeon. So some people say, well, if you're talking about serious linguistic analysis, King Sejong didn't have the ability to do that. That's where the rub starts, that he probably would have relied on somebody like Shin Suk-ju, who was noted as an interpreter and, very skilled linguist. Then there's the family project theory. And the family project theory is Sejong he was surrounded by these anti-Neo-Confucian ministers, Che Ma-li, the man I just mentioned being an example. And he wanted to develop a script, but he did so in secret with his family. And this is the theory. I started out, when I started writing my book, this is the theory, the sole authorship theory that I started with, and I still respect it and understand it. But I kind of gravitated toward the family theory, and I'll tell you why. And the leading proponent is Jung Gwang, who he's retired now, but he was a professor at Koryo Daehakyo. And what's interesting about this theory is it shows Crown Prince Munjong, that's the son, the oldest son, and then Prince Suyang, who later became King Sejong. These two princes were involved in working on Hangeul in some capacity. And then, of course, we have the prince, and then we have genealogies of the Juksan Han clan showed also that Princess Jeonghye was involved. So you have 3 of Sejong's children involved in Hangeul, according to different records here and there. These records, some people say, are not reliable. So we really don't know. But certainly these 2 princes were involved, particularly Prince Suyang was, I'll show you in just a minute, very much involved in Hangeul. So this theory then is, oh, well, King Sejong, it's difficult to imagine somebody developing it by themselves, right? So, but it's also difficult to imagine that King Sejong would make this an open project and risk criticism from the Confucian elite. So then the compromise is that he did it in secret as a family project. And that's what, some people argue. And that's the position I've sort of gravitated to. So just to do a summary, you can see the current academic status of each of these positions. The dominant consensus is still that King Sejong made Hangeul by himself, the sole authorship theory. The collaborative theory is losing support. It kind of goes up and down, but it's losing, waning support. And then this is a plausible alternative, but this is the one that I've been gravitating to. So these 3 approaches, and people will get very, emotional and get, into this stuff. So Jung Gwang, I remember when his book started coming out in the 1990s, people can get really into academic debates about this. But the ultimate problem is there's no record. So you have to just filter through and try to make an argument based on evidence that you have. There's no written record. So none of these theories can say this is the definitive document or this is the definitive book or quote or whatever that indicates which theory is correct. Now this Sokpo Sanjal, this was written by Prince Sujong. So he clearly knew Hangul, right, to write this. I mean, this is an astoundingly beautiful piece of work. And this was written in 1447 in honor of his mother, So-hun, right, Queen So-hun, who died in 1446. So that would be Sejong's wife, the queen. She died in 1446. He wrote this in Life of Buddha, a descriptive text of the life of Buddha in honor of his mother. Then King Sejong thought this was outstanding and beautiful, and he wrote poems about the life of Buddha in honor of his wife. Okay. Now, King Sejong died in 1450. So he died 4 years after his wife. So a lot is going on. You have, King Sejong is having health issues. He's quite, he's near the end of his life. But he wrote this in 1447, 48. The dates are also a matter of debate. But this came out in 1449. So King Sejong wrote this, and then he was inspired by this, which was written by Prince Sujong. So to do this Hangul, Prince Sujong had to know something, so he had to have been involved in Hangul development or creation or usage in some capacity. Then this was the king's response to this. This is prose, okay? And then this is poetry. And what do you notice that's really interesting? If anybody's been to Japan, Japan is an interesting country because if you see a sign that's multilingual, Japanese language is always larger than any other language, right? All the other languages are much smaller. So somebody like me, I got to do this. So here you have the Hangul is bigger than the Chinese in this one. And then you have the Hangul is much bigger than the Chinese. So in a sense, the Hangul being bigger than Chinese is a typographical tool to suggest that it is the main or the more important script in this particular text. So this is, it's not proof, but I take this as evidence that the prince was clearly involved in working on Hangul in some capacity. Then we have this. And okay, these are long, confusing names. So we have the Sokpo Sanjal and the Woring Chonggang Jigok, okay? And then we have this, the Woring Sokpo, which is a combination of both books, okay? And the Woring Sokpo came out in 1459, which is quite a few, at least 10 years later than, it's 10 years later than this, right? And by this time, Prince Sujong had become King Sejong. So he was still interested in using Hangul when he became king. So this is something, that people will say, oh, well, after King Sejong died, Hangul faded away and the Joseon Dynasty was all Confucian and blah, blah, blah. This is evidence in counter to that King Sejong also continued interest in Hangul. He combined the two books into one longer book, which is the Woring Sokpo, okay? And, it's just a wonderful text for understanding Middle Korean. But what do you notice? Look at here, the Chinese characters are larger. So perhaps King Sejong, as time had gone on, the opposition to Hangul, or perhaps he was worried about, he might have wanted to frame Hangul not as an alternative writing system, but as an auxiliary writing system, that it wasn't meant to compete or replace literary Chinese, that it was just meant as a tool to help learn Chinese, which of course was King Sejong's intention to begin with. But in this text, King Sejong is showing that, the Hangul starts to shrink in size, in Chinese characters are getting bigger. That's just a typographical tool that he's using, which also indicates his stance towards Hangul. But this is 10 years later, so quite late. You're already in the last half of the 15th century with this one. So I take these things to indicate as circumstantial evidence, no definitive evidence. I take these to indicate that the idea that King Sejong was working with his kids, or the family idea in the security of his, the royal family's residence in Changdok Palace, it would have been. I take this as evidence that the children were involved and helped continue the Hangeul legacy even after King Sejong left. So that's debate number one. Debate number two, this gets also very emotional if you want it to. I'm not going to be very emotional about it, other than that I love the topic. So here is the traditional, this is the Abraham Lincoln narrative, or the traditional, like the Pilgrim's Landing and Plymouth Rock. King Sejong's sole authorship, Hangeul as a unique ex nihilo script. That means no other writing system influenced it. It's like divine, almost divinely created. So this is the traditional alternative, the traditional view of Hangeul. There are people who have argued at various times that we have other languages and scripts known in the elite circles. So this is where that argument starts to come from. What other scripts might have influenced Hangeul? What did the elite in the Joseon period know in the 1400s, particularly the early 1400s? What other languages would they have known that they could have drawn from? Obvious one is Chinese, but we have some others. Hanmun, right? Chinese. We have the Sayogwon, that was the interpreter's office, and they taught Mandarin Chinese, that's spoken Chinese, Jurchen, Yojino, Jurchen, and Japanese and Mongolian. So those languages were taught in the interpreter's office in the Joseon government. Not many people were involved, but there was knowledge of these languages going around. Then in the Buddhist world, the Shitham script, and then which was used to write Sanskrit. And then I don't really know to pronounce ʼPhags-pa, it's ʼPhags-pa in Korean, ʼPhags-pa script, which was the official script used in the Yuan Dynasty. So this was hanging around and still used. Some people in Korea still knew it because during the Yuan Dynasty, Korea was occupied by the Mongols, and some of the queens were from Mongolia. So the official language between the Yuan Dynasty and Korea was not classical Chinese. It was actually this Mongolian written in the ʼPhags-pa script. So there were people still remaining from that time. Remember, the change was 1392. So some older people, there would have been some knowledge of this script as well. So that's where you get how many different scripts would have been around that Korean, the Korean elite could have influenced. The two big arguments are Chinese and ʼPhags-pa. These are the two arguments that have appeared over time, that these two scripts were the ones that had the most influence on Hangeul. Again, some people argue none did, so keep that in mind. Don't forget that. And here's the ʼPhags-pa script, and it was commissioned by Kublai Khan in 1269 and designed by the Tibetan monk. And what Kublai Khan's idea was, he wanted a universal writing system that all of the languages under Mongolian rule could use. So he wanted a writing system that could be used for Chinese, Mongolian, And he wanted this to unite the empire. Because remember, the Mongolian Empire went all the way to Vienna. At one time, you had the Mongolians ruling all of Central Asia and China, and it was this very large empire. And once, it started to fall apart, but the Asian part still had vast territory. China, Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea was under occupation, Vietnam, So you had a large number of languages. And Kublai Khan's idea was, let's develop a universal writing system for all of these languages. So that's the ʼPhags-pa script. And it looks like this, which looks kind of Sanskritish or Tibetan, right? And of course, a Tibetan monk wrote it, developed this system, so it's heavily influenced by Tibetan. Tibetan, in turn, is influenced by the writing systems in India, Okay, so that's just, and you can see some, it doesn't look like Hangeul, but you can see there are blocks, and that looks like a tiet, right? So that looks like a tiet, yeah. So of course, then the problem with that is English L looks like a neon. So, that's where you start to see problems happening. But anyway, Gari Ledyard, who passed away, I think in 2021, 2022, he was a long time, a well-known professor of Korean studies at Columbia University. He argued that a certain number of sounds, a limited number of sounds from ʼPhags-pa influenced Hangeul. So you can see this character became this. I love this whiteboard. Denny, this is great, this whiteboard. I want to take it home. Anyway, so you have this going to digut, right? And then you have here becomes a biup. So you can see, this is Gari Ledyard's argument that that parts of these letters were pulled out from ʼPhags-pa to make the certain Hangeul letters. Now, the shape being similar that's a pretty weak argument. So it's a little more than the shape. It's also the sound, right? So in Mongolian, this has a k sound. I don't know the exact Mongolian pronunciation, but you can see that then that becomes a g, Korean gyuk, right? There's a similarity in the sounds, okay? So this is where Gari Ledyard is getting his argument from. For example, this is like a p sound. So this becomes, and it's turned over to become a biup. So there's a link between the sounds. And that is a much stronger argument than the shape is similar. I mean, English O could be an eung, right? Or as I just said, L could be a neon or whatever. The shape being similar has, no influence. It's like the word order in English and Chinese are similar, but they're not related languages. It just happens that way. So this is where Ledyard is trying to make a stronger argument by saying that there's this connection between the sounds. And of course, this was to people who think that Hangeul is, a almost like divinely inspired system. This is a kind of heresy. But this is Gari Ledyard's argument. So he's famous for that. Then other people have started to argue that the Shidam script, I don't know how to pronounce that too well. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but anyway, that this script, which was used in Buddhist circles around this time, certainly in the Koryo period, because that was a Buddhist dominated kingdom, that people in Buddhist circles knew this script for Buddhist texts, sutras, and that this could have influenced the shape of certain Hangeul letters. The problem with the Buddhist theory is that runs against Neo-Confucianism, right? So reaching out to Buddhism in that period in the Joseon Dynasty might have been risky for Sejong, even though he was a devout Buddhist and his wife was as well, the queen. They were, very serious Buddhists, but giving Buddhism royal sort of patronage or royal recognition would have been, some people argue that that's something that makes this theory pretty fringe, okay? Because the role of Buddhists was lowered in response to the previous dynasty, the Koryo dynasty, in which Buddhists were more dominant. So this theory kind of gets lowered because of, if you think of the political situation at the time, that would not work. Also, the letters aren't quite as neat as the ʼPhags-pa letters that we just saw, the correspondence. But still, you could see where they might have gotten some ideas for letters. And the other thing is, anybody knows, if you know about the Indian writing systems are what are called an abugida. And an abugida is where the consonant is the start and you add an element to indicate the vowel. And the element can be added at the top, the bottom, the side, various different places. So breaking the linear, getting away from the linear idea, some people say that influence, that comes from these Indian scripts, which came through Buddhism. And this is a lovely this isn't advocating anything, but you can just see you have a Gyok, right? And then this is the ʼPhags-pa script. This is Tibetan. 4 is Gupta. 5 is Brahmi. Brahmi is the ancient script that the edicts of Asoka are written in, or Ashoka. The edicts of Ashoka are written in the Brahmi script. So these are all Abhagudas. And then, so you might have, this is probably the basic element, but to make another, you would add something to indicate another vowel sound. And you have Digut, and then this goes all the way through. So some people, and of course, just a minute. Yeah, 6 and 7. This is controversial. Don't look at 6 and 7. This gave me headaches because the problem why it gave me headaches is number 5. This row is nobody knows the origin of the Brahmi script either. And Western scholars like to argue that it's somehow connected to Amoraic, which is connected to Phoenician, which is connected. So they argue that it's essentially kind of a Western script. A lot of South Asian scholars argue that it's indigenous and unique. And digging into the weeds of that was difficult, but I did it. You can read the book and find my position. But anyway, so there is this connection, but if you just start at number 5 and go through, you can see where there could be a connection. The problem is, what's the problem? These scripts didn't have status in the Joseon period, so it's difficult to imagine King Sejong, who was trying to be loyal to the Ming Dynasty, trying to have this great relationship with China. He wasn't denying Confucianism, even though he was personally a Buddhist. He was promoting Neo-Confucianism. He was promoting Korea's relationship with Ming China. There's nothing in the times or King Sejong's policies that would suggest that he would be attracted to reaching out to some other script for, say, very serious inspiration. But that leaves the question of perhaps certain ideas got through. So that's where you have the question. Okay, my take is that really, if you're thinking about another writing system influencing Hangul, it's probably Chinese, just simply because of the history of the time, the knowledge of Chinese, literary Chinese, and again, the Ming Dynasty connection that King Sejong, before King Sejong, but the early Joseon period, there was a lot of back and forth. A lot of Koreans went to China. They wanted to reach out to the Ming. There was a boom in learning spoken Chinese, okay, not just literary Chinese. So I think and then these systems, based on Chinese characters, these systems, Idu, Hyangchal, and Kugyal, they were used to use Chinese characters. They used Chinese characters to show sounds. So, for example, E would use a Chinese character, or Gu or whatever would use a Chinese character. Chinese characters were used to indicate different sounds. And this had been used ever since the Shilla period, or even before, the Three Kingdoms period. So they had examples of using Chinese characters, and Koreans were very good in literary Chinese, the elite. So if you have any possible influence, my take is that it's Chinese. How? That's this. Just a brief overlook of Chinese, but not all. Some Chinese characters started out as images, right? Pictures, and then developed into characters. Most are not this way. There's only about a couple hundred that developed from this. So people who think that Chinese characters are unquote pictographs or ideographs or whatever, that's kind of Orientalist approach, right? Most Chinese characters are actually sound-based. So you put the left side will have some sort of semantic meaning, like water this way, and the right side will have the pronunciation. So most Chinese characters are sound-based, about 90% of them. But anyway, Koreans were not only familiar with literary Chinese, they were also familiar with the history of Chinese characters. And the thing that's interesting about Chinese characters, and this is very important for my argument, is the pieces. Okay, these are the elements, right? So you have a limited number of strokes. Chinese characters have a limited number of strokes. You can go this way or this way, this way, this way, whatever. Anybody studied Japanese or Chinese in school? Yeah, okay. I remember when I studied Japanese way back in the 1980s, you know, American kids just want to write it the way it looks. And the teachers would go insane. And, you know, we'd have to follow the way it's written. And, you know, so you have to write it this certain way. But it's a limited number of lines. So all Chinese characters come from this limited number of lines. And then those lines are then pieces are put together, and then they're organized into boxes. And the boxes can have, for example, like nothing. This could be a mium, right? I mean, it could. Mium, yeah. Or, you know, these are all the more unquote pictographic. And then you have, you know, top and bottom. You have these different parts of the square that are divided, and you put different characters together to make another character. Okay. So the idea of dividing a box into pieces then was something that the Koreans who were working on Hangeul would have known and would have experienced, because they also wrote. They didn't use cell phones like I do nowadays, right? So they wrote. So that means that the idea of, so this means initial and, you know, vowel and final and, you know, so anyway, you have these different boxes for Hangeul. So this could be the idea of putting Hangeul pieces together into a box that probably came from Chinese. But that doesn't mean Hangeul is influenced by Chinese, the actual pieces, right? But it still could be, you know, this neon could be similar to, say, this thing here. So, but the sound is, of course, different, right? So what I think would have happened is that because Koreans had a high knowledge of literary Chinese, they were able to say, okay, we like the economy of the Chinese boxes. You know, you can get a lot of meaning in one box. But we don't like the fact you have to memorize the pronunciation. If you've ever studied Japanese, believe me, it's, you know, like it's a real pain. Yeah. And when I taught in Kagoshima University, I remember these names on the, you know, you have 50 students in the class, and the last names that you could pronounce are maybe 10, you know, and Yamamoto, oh yes, you get an A because your name is easy to read, you know, I mean, yeah. So I finally convinced the office to write the names in Romanization. And they did that, and they did that for other professors. And of course, Japanese professors thanked me because they had trouble with the names too. So, you know, so that's the big difference with Chinese. For these pronunciations, you kind of have to, you can guess, or you can use your connection with knowledge, right? For example, this one with water, water. Yeah, you can see that, you know, the left side or elements will give you a hint of the pronunciation, but you still have to memorize it, okay? Whereas Hangeul, everything in the pronunciation is just given for you. But the idea of organizing it into a box, that's what I think they got from Chinese. And it sounds profound, but it really, I mean, if you look at it really isn't that profound if you think, okay, where are the people, you know, King Sejong, if it's his family, where were they getting their inspiration from? And politically appropriate, given the context of the times, it would have had to have been Chinese. So that's the idea then of certain parts of how Hangeul works, perhaps was influenced by Chinese. The big difference, though, is, again, this is from the Dongnip Shinmun, is there are so many of these. And it's hard to dig through the pronunciation, right? The characters don't tell you the pronunciation. You've got to guess. Whereas this is the idea of the letters giving you the pronunciation. And that fits with the goal of the Hunmin Jeongeum. Easy to pronounce. And of course, also if you look at it, easy to write because everything repeats. These elements, they're only, when the Hunmin Jeongeum came out, there were 28 letters. Now there are 24. 4 have been lost, including the famous one that was used in Squid Games. Right, that was a zzz sound, and that's been lost. But anyway, these, are, because they repeat, they're easy to write. Say much easier to write than Chinese. So my take, number 1, family project. Number 2, Chinese perhaps is the most likely influence on Hangul. Debate number 3. Okay, so Hangul use in the Joseon period, in the Joseon period. This one, again, we have a kind of established discourse, which is literary Chinese remain dominant. Confucianized Joseon looked down on Hangul. That's the dominant discourse. And it was only used by women and commoners, as if women and commoners don't count, right? So why don't women and commoners count? They do. So my argument is that women and commoners actually do count. And there were other uses besides. So what I found in going through all this stuff was all this material is there are 4 main Hangul purposes, user groups during the Joseon period, and court women. Okay, so it was used for letters, diaries, all kinds of correspondence by women in the court, elite circles. Popular novels, Hangeul Dongjeon, right, that all of our Korean members have studied in high school, probably. And then it was also in very important pedagogical aid for learning Chinese. Because remember, Hangul can tell you the pronunciation of something, so it immediately became a good candidate for annotation, showing the pronunciation. You didn't have to read it. You didn't have to write it. Nobody was saying a Yangban or, somebody, the Yangban's son is going to learn to write Hangul and, that's the person's main language. But it was a pronunciation tool, say, similar to how IPA is in Korean dictionaries, right? It's, the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, is used to give pronunciation. So and then, of course, also textual annotation in Buddhist texts, other types of texts, Hangul was used. So it actually, if you add all of these groups up together, you get quite a large user base. And of course, the Yangban might have also secretly read the same novels the commoners were reading. That's the Marie Antoinette syndrome, right? You want to be a commoner, you go out and play on a swing or something. So, you would have, even in the palaces or in elite circles, you would have Hangul documents circulating because they were literary. They would have read Hangul, and the language of Hangeul Dongjeon or these other, the novels, the popular novels, was not classical Chinese, obviously. It was Korean vernacular, so they would have been able to easily understand it. So that is, my take on this one. I'm giving you my take before doing a little more talking about it, but Hangul is actually more important in the Joseon period than most people think. If you add up the population of the literary, these user groups, and then how it was particularly how it was used as a pedagogical aid for learning literary Chinese, this is a key and important point, because it became part of everybody's education. So even it wasn't used for government records. It wasn't used for Yangban would not have written records or books in Hangul. They would have done that in classical literary Chinese, but it was a very important part of the linguistic picture. So the Joseon period, what do you have? You have literary Chinese, then you have Idu still holding on, and Idu is a system to indicate Korean pronunciation using Chinese characters. Similar how to say Japanese does that as well. And then you have Hangul. So you actually had 3 writing systems circulating in the Joseon period. And maybe, you know, when the Christians, the Catholic missionaries came in, there would have been a little Romanization, but that's a very specialized, limited group. So, Court Women, this is a book from 1475, which isn't that late. It's quite early. But this shows, you know, you're using Hangeul here to indicate grammatical particles, and you're moving the Chinese around to fit Korean word order, or using Hangeul to suggest the Korean word order to make it easier to read. Because remember, literary Chinese is the Chinese word order. I am a boy, not I boy am, right? So the Chinese word order is different, and the structure of the language is different. So often they would use Hangeul to indicate what is the subject and what is the object and how to move things around to make it easier to read. So this is one example of a very well-known book in the court. And then this Hangeul Dongjeon, right? So this, you know, is all written in Hangeul, no spaces. Spaces came in with the Dongnip Shinmun in 1896. So again, and you have these books were lent to people, public recitings. People, they were in circulation, so they were hero stories, kind of, you know, mythology, this kind of thing. So these books were popular. So there has to be a reader base for these to come down to us today, for these stories, these popular novels to come down to us today. There would have had to have been a reader base, right? Or people wouldn't have produced them. So this also suggests a large use of Hangeul in the Joseon period. And then the pedagogical aid and how that works. This is a famous book. This one is, yes, Hunmong Jahue, and that came out in 1527. This is the book that organized the order of Hangeul that we have today, or at least in South Korea. So this book gave it, you have, you know, it shows the order of different things. And so this book, and it also gave the names of the letters. So Gyeok, Yeong, all of these names came from this book from 1527. And this book was an explanation of how to use Hangeul as a pedagogical tool. And it became reprinted and was used continuously through the Joseon period. So you have, you know, the order of different things. It explained Hangeul, and it explained how to use Hangeul as a tool to read and interpret the pronunciation of Chinese characters. So this was an important one. And then we have textual annotation. This is a book, the Yuso Pilji. And this book was kind of like a dictionary of Idu. And Idu, again, was using Chinese characters to indicate the sound of a Korean syllable, okay? And that was used to help people understand classical Chinese. You would put an Idu character maybe to the side or in the middle or different, wherever you wanted to put it, but it would be used to help people understand the text. And this is a dictionary of how to use, written in Hangeul, using Hangeul to help you understand and use the Idu system. So again, annotating, there were Buddhist texts that were annotated, and that was very similar to how other texts would have been annotated. You have the Buddhist text written in literary Chinese, so you would have Hangeul used to indicate the subject, the object, or different grammatical particles, and people would look at it and move the different elements around, and that would help them understand. So that, you know, that is a key point in how you have a large user base of people in the Joseon Dynasty, which meant that later at the end of the Joseon Dynasty, when you had the Dongnip Shinmun come out and the missionaries promoting Hangeul, and later Kojong promoting Hangeul, that you had a reader base. You know, there were enough people who knew Hangeul, who were able to deal with it, you know, who could use it, that it wasn't the shock that it seems to a lot of people. In other words, there were enough people that there was a base of users that it was easy to make the switch. Why it was difficult was because of the prestige of literary Chinese, not the lack of knowledge of Hangul. And those are different things. Those two are different things. So just to go to the conclusion, oh, we have some time, yeah? Good, okay. So debate number one, who created Hangul? I'm gonna lean toward the family project theory. I hope I don't get my head cut off. Because I think the involvement of the princes suggests that it's hard to imagine King Sejong sitting around talking to himself and using a mirror. Now, I use a mirror when I practice language because I'm a linguistic nerd. Okay. You know, that's one of the best ways to learn pronunciation is to actually use a mirror in front of your mouth. Have you done that? No, you guys, yeah, do it. Yeah. Sometimes a tiny shower in a one room with a mirror right there, you know, it's great. So a mirror, you know, because a lot of the phonetics, a lot of language is the shape of your mouth. So I can't really imagine King Sejong sitting around playing with a mirror, looking at his mouth, but I can imagine him talking to his sons and daughter, bantering back and forth and coming to an understanding of the different sounds, and then somehow later together or even by himself, coming up with the letters for each sound, because each letter corresponds to a sound. So somebody had to do that linguistic footwork. And I think it's difficult to imagine Sejong doing it by himself. I don't mean to, you know, I think the family theory has a lot of merit. Then the Hangul is ex nihilo. Okay, I will argue for the influence of Chinese characters. But influence does not mean copy, right? So the problem with Gari Ledyard's theory is he assumed that the letters were moved directly from ʼPhags-pa script right into Korean. And I'm not making that assumption. I'm making the assumption that the idea of organizing the Hangul graphemes, the pieces, into a box, that's what came from Chinese. So that's my argument with that one. And then three, I've just said, is it was used more than most established histories indicate, which is why when Korea, you know, right at the end of the 19th century, why Hangul was able to spread among Koreans. And it was the Japanese later who took control of the education system, and that's where Hangul was repressed. But as far as the common people or the ability to use the spread of Hangul in the 19th century, that built on the base of Hangul knowledge during the other earlier parts of the Joseon period. So if you want this is a great book about Hangul. If you're really interested in this stuff, take a picture of the references. But this in English is a very, very good book about Hangul. If you want to dig into Zhongguang, this is a good one for Zhongguang. He was very much criticized when he came out because he, you know, one of his sentences was something about, you know, 인도 문자 영향을 아닐 수는 없다. Like, you know, well, anyway, Lee Gi-moon is fabulous, right? This is a very easy book to understand. So this is a good source. And then if you want Lee Gi-moon in English, unfortunately, this book costs more than $100, but Lee Gi-moon in English, you have a translation, History of Korean Language. And if you read Japanese, Noma Hideki's book, Hangul no Tanjo, Ningen, you know, whatever. So anyway, the book, if you read Japanese, Noma Hideki's book is a very, very good book. So these are just a few selected references. And with that, I will finish. Thank you.